नाशकाय श्रीनीलकण्ठाय वृषध्वजाय तस्मै शिकाराय नमः शिवाय वसिष्ठकुम्भोद्भगौतमाय मुनीन्द्रदेवार्चितशेखराय चन्द्रार्कवैश्वानरलोचनाय तस्मै वकाराय नमः शिवाय यज्ञस्वरूपाय जटाधराय पिनाकहस्ताय सनातनाय दिव्याय देवाय दिगम्बराय तस्मै यकाराय नमः शिवाय पञ्चाक्षरमिदं पुण्यं यः पठेत शिवसन्निधौ शिवलोकमवाप्नोति शिवेन सह मोदते।
Namaste, namaste, one and all. I am John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. And this broadcast is week 5 of 13 of the fall volume of the project, which is our Unified Humanities Curricula here at the college. I encourage you to check out our website down below. And we offer full-time enrollment for high school students. That is to replace completely any other classes. And don't worry, your days will be very full with the reading syllabi. And then for adult students, well, your days will be just as full, but you don't have social conventions to keep up with. So anyway, we do have full-time enrollment for the project. We also have monthly seminars, bi-weekly seminars. So there are many ways you can enroll in the course. And even if you're not able to do that, you're always welcome to join us for these weekly broadcasts. So there we go. And we are indeed week 5 of 13 of the project, and we're getting into Aryan Bards, and we're moving very, very close to the beginning of history proper, which of course starts with writing. And we might see either the memorization of large swaths of poetry, which we'll get into today, or writing proper, really as elaborations off of the human desire for immortality, which of course gave rise to religions in our previous classes. We'll see that develop, and when we get to written language and Sumerian things, which actually at the end of this week 5, we dip our toes into, but we'll address that head on next week in our recordings. But in any case, we're looking for the way to survive the grave in so many ways. We looked at that even earlier in our time together with the differences of the human being and the animal, and one of which is the concept of time. Animals do not have a concept of time except in some extraordinary circumstances, such as slaughterhouses, where animals can tell what's up in the immediate future for them. But even that, one might argue, is instinct. The human being can think about time, past, present, and future, in ways far more abstract than livestock, let's say. And of course, that means consciousness of death. And so how do you transcend death? Well, you can do that by memorizing lots of poetry and passing it on to people. So that is our bardic look. And Of course, we're looking at the Aryans, this group of people that come out of the Caucasus and end up settling down everywhere from Bangladesh to Ireland and down into Spain, and that's a huge swath. That is a huge swath of land, and we can see similarities, which H.G. Wells will enlighten us about. Before we get too long in the tooth, here's our beautiful website. We have all sorts of things coming up. We have the Transitus of St. Francis, a beautiful ceremony on the evening of October 3rd, celebrating his transition into heaven. And we're going to be meeting in New Milford, and you can find out about that on the site. More long-term, we have open events coming up. This is a great way, if you're considering enrolling in any of our courses, this is a great way to get an idea of the rhythm of the school and to also involve yourself with the rhythm of our dear college. So these are probably the most after just following our stuff online, interview series, classes like this, whatever, the open events are your next hit, your next fix for Apocatastasis. You've been intrigued by what we're building here in Connecticut, and you want to get more attached to the Institute. Well, this is your next step, right? So these are all standalone seminars, although they're grouped in series, which you're welcome to join. And I leave it to you to check that out on our site. And there's all sorts of other goodies as well. Now we move to our poetry section. Now, when the project comes to its final instantiation, all the poetry will be synchronized to the topics in each week's reading. That is some time off. Let's say right now there's a lot more immediate editorial work which is required. So for right now, we're going to just get the random poems that I put out for the college's Substack. And this week, being fall here in New England, we have To a Mouse by Aryan Bards, Scotland's national poet. Mice, you come to find out, are very cute when they are singular. When it is a single mouse, they are very cute. The second the mouse becomes mice and there are two or more, they stop being cute. But Robbie Barnes this week reminds us to have pity on our fellow mortals, however rodent and small they may be. Here we go. Sleek, tiny, timorous, cowering beast, why such panic in your breast? Why dash away so quick, so rash, in a frenzied flash, when I would be loath to run after you with a murderous blouse staff? I'm truly sorry a man's dominion has broken nature's social union, and justifies that bad opinion which makes you startle, when I'm your poor earth-bound companion and fellow mortal. I have no doubt you sometimes thieve. What if it, friend, you too must leave a random corner in a shock's a small behest? It'll give me a blessing to know such a loss. I'll never miss it. Your tiny house lies in a ruin, its fragile walls wind-rent and strewn. Now nothing's left to construct a new one of mosses green, since bleak December's winds ensuing blow fast and keen. You saw your fields laid bare and waste, with weary winter closing face, and closing here beneath the blaze. You thought to dwell till crash, the cruel iron plowshare passed straight through your cell. That flimsy heap of leaves and stubble had cost you many a weary nibble. Now you're turned out for all your trouble, less house and hold, to endure the winter's icy dribble and harfrost's cold. But, mouse friend, you are not alone. In proving foresight may be vain. The blessed laid schemes of mice and main go oft awry, and leave us only grief and pain for promised joy. Still, friend, you're blessed compared with me. Only present dangers make you flee, but behind me I can see grim prospects drear, while forward-looking seers we human guess, and fear. Tu autem Domine, miserere nobis, Deo gratias. Thus is Robbie Burns' poem, To a Mouse. Okay, now we get into our week 1, or excuse me, our first reading of week 5, pardon. And we're just picking up where we left off, looking at the Aryans and the Dravidians, in particular, looking at their linguistic footprint. Now, I'm not going to go over that. We've covered it for the past 2 weeks, but that's basically what Sunday and Monday is taken up with. I'd like to move more into the Bard development, which you see indeed everywhere from India to the British Isles. Okay. And as I say, we prime ourselves for next week when we get into the early civilizations, which means writing. That's when history begins. So, coming attractions. All right. His social life was growing. Man was now living in clans and tribal communities. These clans and communities clashed and took each other's grazing land, for they sought to rob each other. And there began a new thing in human life: war. Okay, so here is, another aspect. Do we call it a development? Well, organizationally it is. Spiritually it's not. For war is not a primeval thing. It has not been in this world for more than 20,000 years. To this day, primitive people, such as the Australian blackfellows, do not understand war. The Paleolithic age was an age of fights and murder, no doubt, but not of organized collective fighting, of numbers of men. So that's your definition of war. I think we can all agree with that. Organized collective fighting. But now men could talk together and group themselves under leaders, and they found a need of centers where they could come together with their cattle in time of raids and dangers. They began to make camps with walls of earth and palisades, many of which are still traced in the history-worn contours of the European scenery. The leaders under whom men fought in wars were often the same men as the sacrificial purifiers who were their early priests. Which is interesting. I was just meditating on that today. How many, almost everything it would seem, comes out of the temple. How many things of life come out of the temple? So now we see war, in a sense, as a development of the temple, as people are organized around their shamans and their priests. In military formations, however crude. Things like drama, art, literature, education, formal education. All of these are spin-offs of the temple. And when I say the temple, I just mean the religious aspect of life, regardless of the spiritual system. So very interesting altogether, this aspect. The knowledge of bronze spread late in Europe. Neolithic man had been making his slow advances, age by age, for 7,000 or 8,000 years before the metals come. By that time, his social life had developed so that there were men of various occupations and men and women of different ranks in the community. So we see the specialization of labor, which necessitates living together in larger and more complex societies, because after all, the individual now can only be a farmer or a blacksmith or a weaver or whatever the case may be. He cannot be those other things. He has to specialize in order to really develop his craft. And so he needs other people to do those jobs, and they are just as equally precarious and dependent on their fellows. So we see the necessity of living in more complex societies. The women span and wove and embroidered. There were chiefs and families that were distinguished as leaderly and noble. A man varied the monotony of his herding and wandering. He consecrated undertakings and celebrated triumphs, held funeral assemblies, and distinguished the traditional seasons of the years by feasts. Again, an elaboration off of the religious impulse. His needs we have already glanced at, but somewhere between 10,000 BC and the broadening separation of the Aryan peoples towards 2 or 1,000 BC, mankind discovered fermentation and yay, the brewing of intoxicating drinks. Hooray! He made these of honey and of barley, and as the Aryan tribe spread southward of the grape, and he got merry and drunken. Whether he first used yeast to make his bread light or to ferment his drink, we do not know. So the diversification of the palate we come across. Now, how do we have this? Well, we have artwork, we have funeral leavings, funeral gifts and things. And believe it or not, even things like wheat in the drier climates can be preserved in some of these burials. So we can chart this development roughly, give or take 1,000 years. That's a long time, but it's not a long time in the big picture. At his feast, so by the way, we can also chart it from things like, we're going to get there, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, we know those as written down documents. We have to remember that they were memorized for a long time before, so they're fingerprints of a much earlier age. We might say the author we call Homer operated in, I know there's disagreement, but I'll say 700 BC. But he's just transmitting a much earlier oral tradition, which speaks of grapes and wine. And we can say the same with the Bible stories and other traditions as well. The Vedas, which we kicked off this class with, right? Yeah, they're all written down now, but that's not how they started. At his feast, there were individuals with a gift for playing the fool, who did no doubt win the laughter of their friends. But there was also another sort of men, of great importance in their time and still more important to the historian, certain singers of songs and stories. The bards or rhapsodists. These bards existed among all the Aryan-speaking peoples. They were a consequence of, and a further factor in that development of spoken language, which was the chief of all the human advances made in Neolithic times. They chanted or recited stories of the past, stories of the living chief and his people, and they told other stories that they invented. They memorized jokes and catches. They fought and seized upon and improved the rhythms, rhymes, alliterations, and such like possibilities latent in language. They probably did much to elaborate and fix grammatical forms. They were the first great artists of the ear. They were the first great artists of the ear. As the later Aurogean rock painters were the first great artists of the eye and hand. We looked at those rock paintings a few weeks back. Now we have another development, oral art. No doubt they used much gesture. Probably they learned appropriate gestures when they learned their songs. But the order and sweetness and power of language was their primary concern. Language is passing down the memory of the tribe, its glories, as we'll find out with the Irish Tame, the glories of a cattle raid, and the glories of, in the case of Homer, long forgotten wars, never to be forgotten because of the bards. And they made a new step forward in the power and range of the human mind. They sustained and developed in men's minds a sense of a greater something than themselves, the tribe, right? So this is, again, an increasing sophistication of consciousness in man and of the life that extended back into the past. They were not only recalled, these bards and their songs, not only recalled old hatreds and battles, they recalled old alliances and a common, here we go, culture. This is what we're doing in the project, a common inheritance. The feats of dead heroes live it again. A new thought come into men's minds, the desire to be remembered. Men began to live in thought before they were born and after they were dead. So this is a major abstraction. Even things we would call primitive stories, cattle raids or whatever. Primitive stories, they actually are quite abstract if you think about it, based off of this sentence, right? Men began to live in thought before they were born and after they were dead. When Aeneas, and this is much after our time here, when Aeneas is thinking about his progeny, in a sense, or Virgil, He's time traveling in a sense. So Virgil in the first century, he's writing about Aeneas about, again, 700-800 BC, that semi-mythological Roman time. And imagine the reader of Virgil. So he's reading about his ancestor Aeneas, and he's reading about his ancestor Aeneas dreaming about the reader, dreaming about his subsequent Roman progeny. Right? So this is what H.G. Wells means when he says men begin to live in thought before they were born. And of course, we can easily ascertain after they were dead. Like most human beings, this bardic tradition grew first slowly and then more rapidly. By the time of the Bronze Age was coming into Europe, there was not an Aryan people that had not a profession and training of bards. In their hands, language become as beautiful as it ever likely is to be. These bards were living books, man histories, guardians and makers of a new and more powerful tradition in human life. Every Aryan people had its long poetical records, thus handed down its sagas, such as the Teutons and its epics for the Greeks and its Vedas for the Indians. The earliest Aryan people were essentially a people of the voice. The recitation seems to have predominated even in those ceremonial and dramatic dances, that dressing up, among which most human races have also served for the transmission of tradition. Right? Early on in the opening minutes of this class, we had that chanting, right? And we can see how that chanting of the Vedas in this instance, even in a few minutes, we can see how it can bring us into a rhythm, almost a mystical rhythm. So you can see how these things lend themselves to religious ceremonies, whether that's your Vedas here, different group altogether, but the Hebrews and the Arabs with their Bibles and their Korans, and all sorts of religious chanting. I guess it all goes back to this impulse. This is why, and we're going to get to here in a little bit, the importance of Homer to the Greeks and his influence on modern culture. This preservation within bardic works of the past and how it can inform the future. Why it's important to memorize poetry, even if it's only a stanza a day or a stanza a week, even if you inevitably forget pieces that you don't regularly revisit. It's still very much worthwhile to memorize poetry, which is why we make such a big deal of it here at the Institute. At that time, there was no writing. There was no writing, which means there was no history. And when the first art of writing crept into Europe, as we shall tell later, it must have seemed far too slow and clumsy and lifeless a method of record for men to trouble very much about writing down these glowing and beautiful treasures of memory, kept for accounts and matters of fact. The bards and rhapsodists flourished for a long time after the introduction of writing. They survived indeed in Europe as the minstrels in the Middle Ages, as the folk singers of our day. Those are very much in the bardic tradition. Now, there's another thing that grows out of the temple, to my earlier comments. We say writing, commerce. There we go. Commerce and records. The initial records, we'll find out when we get to Samaria next week, Egypt. The initial records are business records, but they're records kept in the temple. So even commerce and therefore legality and contract, all of this, it's really amazing. Almost everything grows out of the religious impulse socially expressed in religion. Unhappily, their tradition had not the fixity of written record, which may not be so fixed after all. Not even in the fact that records may be lost, but also that the ways words are used, as you and I know, change. Anyhow, they amended and reconstructed and had their fashions and their phrases of negligence. Accordingly, we have now only a very much altered and revised vestiges of that spoken literature of prehistoric times. One of the most interesting and informing of these prehistoric compositions, the Aryans, survives in the Greek Iliad. Now, this is not the only time we're going to be dealing with the Iliad, so much less the Odyssey. But this is the first time we approaches. So we'll go on here. An early form of the Iliad was probably recited 1000 BC, but it was not written down until perhaps 700 or 600 BC. Many men must have had to do with it as its authors and improvers, but later Greek tradition attributed it to a blind bard named Homer, to whom also is ascribed in the Odyssey a composition of a very different spirit and outlook. To be a bard was naturally a blind man's occupation. The Slavs called an old bard a selipak, which was also their word for a blind man. Very interesting. The original recited version of the Iliad was older than that of the Odyssey. The Iliad, quote, is as complete a poem, is older than the Odyssey, though the material of the Odyssey, being largely undateable folklore, is older than any of the historical material in the Iliad, unquote. Both epics were probably written over and rewritten by some poet of a later date, in much the same manner that Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate of Queen Victoria, in his Idylls of the King, wrote over the Morte d'Arthur, which was itself a writing over by Sir Thomas Malory from the 15th century, these all being pre-existing legends, making the speeches and sentiments of the character more in accordance with those of his own time. But the events of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the way of living they describe, the spirit of these acts recorded, belong to the closing centuries of the prehistoric age. These sagas and epics and Vedas do supply, in addition to archaeology and philology, a third source of information about these vanished times. Here, for example, is the concluding passage of the Iliad describing very exactly the making of a prehistoric barrow. And then there's this quote here. We're going to get to the Odyssey, so we don't need to dive in here. You'll, of course, have read all of this. Okay. Now we're going to skip ahead before we get to our supplementary article. Okay, so again, we're looking at this bardic tradition, and the Iliad, though it's written, is a much older story. So these early Greeks of the Iliad are sturdy fighters, but without discipline. Their battles, again, this is prehistoric warfare, so-called. You know, it's very primitive. It is a warfare because you have masked men fighting on different sides, but still, their battles are confusing single combats. They have horses, but no cavalry. They used the horse, which is a comparatively recent addition to Aryan resources, to drag a rude fighting chariot into battle. The horse is still novel enough to be something of a terror in itself. For ordinary draft purposes, as in the quotation from the Iliad above, the oxen were employed. The only priests, and we see that, for instance, where, oh golly, is it Hector's father? Yes, I believe. Hector's father sallies out to go ask Achilles, I think, for the body of his son. Well, he goes out with an ox wagon, not pulled by horses. The only priests of these Aryans are the keepers of shrines and sacred places. They are chiefs who are heads of families and who also perform sacrifices. So again, the merger, the overlay of the so-called civil power, the chief, and the religious shaman. There does not seem to be much mystery or sacramental feeling in their religion. When the Greeks go to war, these heads and elders meet in council and appoint a king whose powers are very loosely defined. There are no laws, but only customs, and no exact standards of conduct. The social life of the early Greeks centered around the households of these leading men. And just one final, one final point I wanted to just bounce over to India, because there's, speaking of the bardic tradition across peoples. Okay, he's quoting an Indian author. The joint family system, quote unquote, he said, has descended to us from time immemorial. The Aryan patriarchal system of old, still holding sway in India. The structure, so the structure of the Indian family is the Aryan family. The structure of the ancient remains full of life. The joint family, the joint family is a cooperative corporation in which men and women have a well-defined place. At the head of the corporation is the senior member of the family, generally the eldest male, but in his absence, the senior female, right? And Wales notes, look at Penelope in the Odyssey. She fits that structure perfectly, right? Ulysses is the head of the family until he goes away, then she becomes the leader until he comes back, and then she's no longer the leader. All able-bodied members must contribute their labor and earnings, whether of personal skills or agriculture and trade, to the common stock. Weaker members, widows, orphans, and destitute relations, all must be maintained and supported. Sons, nephews, brothers, cousins, all must be treated equally, for any undue preference is apt to break up the family. We have no word for cousins. They are either brothers or sisters, and we do not know what cousins are 2 degrees removed. The children of the first cousin are your nephews and nieces. And he goes on with these specifics. I just wanted to make a point about the Vedas being, passed on by the women of the family. There are many bonds, I say in the middle of the screen, there are many bonds which bind the family together, bonds of sympathy, common pleasure, sorrows. When a death occurs, the members go into mourning. When there's a birth or a wedding, the whole family rejoices. And above all, the family deity, some image of Vishnu, the preserver, his place in a separate room, generally known as the room of God, or in a well-to-do family, a temple attached to the house, where the family performs its worship. There's a sense of personal attachment between this image of the deity and the family. The image generally comes down from past generations, often miraculously acquired via pious ancestor at some remote time. Now, pious, I won't derail the class on this very interesting word, but pious here is a very rich word, which we no longer comprehend. Pious, in the classical and even prehistoric world, has this idea at one and the same time, religious devotion and familial bonds. And you can see that here with the mythology around where the family gets its household charms and its household image of the gods and so forth, right? This is, one thing on top of the other: family, bloodline devotion, and religious devotion. The household gods is intimately associated with the family priest. The Hindu priest is a part of the family life of his flock, between whom and himself the tie existed for many generations. The priest is not generally a man of much learning. He knows, however, the traditions of his faith, and the priest serves the bardic role. And then just one final thing. Talking about male and female servants, how they're kind of grafted into the family. Okay. With Hindu life is bound up its traditional duty of hospitality. It is the duty of a householder to offer a meal to any stranger who may come before him at midday and ask for one. The mistress of the house does not sit down to her meal until every member is fed, and as sometimes her food is all that is left, she does not take her meal until well after midday, lest the hungry stranger should come and claim one. We have been tempted to quote Mr. Basu at some length. This is the Indian author, because here we do get something like a living understanding of the type of household which has prevailed in human communities since Neolithic days, which still prevails in India today, China, and the Far East, but which in the West is rapidly, 1920 is this publication, rapidly giving ground before the state and municipal organization of education and a large-scale industrialization, within which an amount of individual detachment and freedom is possible, such as these great households never knew. Yeah, people have no idea how recent the nuclear family is and how much of a disruption to traditional living patterns. I often shock so-called English-speaking so-called conservatives when I point out how radical and revolutionary the nuclear family is. But you did see this multi-generational living, largely for I say economical reasons, but there's no economy in the prehistoric time, but yet there is. When we think of economy, we think of money and things, but that's just an abstraction of resources. So whether it's indeed money or cows or land or farm labor, one of the reasons you often always see large families, whether that's in the prehistoric times, India, the Irish and the Scottish and so forth, multi-generations nowadays, the Spanish speakers who come up here to miserable North America. Why do you see multi-generations living together? Well, because you can pool your resources. Everyone's taken care of, even if they can't take care of themselves. And basically everything's far more efficient. The socialized family of multi-generations is far more efficient than the atomized, isolated, every man for himself monstrosity of the nuclear family, something that can only exist in super industrialized modernity. But let us return to how history preserved for us, how it is preserved for us in the Aryan epics. The Sanskrit epics tell a very similar story to the underlying world of the Iliad, the story of fair, light-skinned, beef-eating people. Only later did they become vegetarians, coming down from Persia into the plains of northern India and conquering their way slowly towards the Indus. From the Indus, they spread over India, but as they spread, they acquired much from the dark Dravidians they conquered, and they seem to have lost their bardic tradition. The Vedas, said Mr. Basu, were transmitted chiefly in the households by the women. Now bouncing to another part of the Aryan world, the oral tradition of the Celtic peoples, who progressed westward, has not been preserved so completely as that of the Greeks or the Indians. It was written down many centuries later, and so, like the bardic primitive English Beowulf story, it has lost any clear evidence of a period of migration into the lands of the antecedent peoples. If the pre-Aryans figure in it at all, it is the fairy folk of the Irish stories. Ireland, the most cut off of all the Celtic-speaking communities, retained to the latest date its primitive life. And the Táin, the Irish Iliad, describes the cattle-keeping life in which war chariots are still used, and war dogs also, and the heads of the slain are carried around, slung about the horse's neck. The Táin is the story of a cattle raid. Here, too, the same social order appears as in the Iliad. The chiefs sit and feast in great halls. They build halls for themselves, as like Beowulf, right? And there is singing and storytelling by the bards, and drinking and intoxication. Yay! Priests are not very much in evidence, but there is a sort of medicine man, shaman, who deals in spells and prophecies. Tu autem numine vis sedere nobis. We'll put the bird down for this section of class right now. I don't want to get into the first civilizations. Now, in our reading this week, we do, but we'll hit that stuff head on in our broadcast next week. But now we get into a topic which will come up again and again and again, and that's the legacy of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So hard to exaggerate how important this is as an artifact of culture, of the bardic tradition, and for many other ways having to do with the afterlife of the written works of Homer. Storytelling was a prevalent tradition throughout the ancient world of Greece. Originally, the mythological stories were told orally and later performed by playwrights at the city's festivals, again coming out of the temple, until the ancient Greeks rediscovered the jewel of the written word, and Homer's epics quickly become physical text. The origins of lyric poetry can be originated to ancient Greece. That's strange use of the word originated. Being heavily insightful in modern understandings of the beliefs and customs of the early Greeks. Lyra, which come to be known as lyric poetry, has multiple forms. However, the most influential are arguably the archaic methods of storytelling seen in Homer's epics. Had a thought there which has escaped me, I'm afraid. The archaic lyric poetry is narrative storytelling of heroes and myths and was always created with the purpose of teaching morals and beliefs to society. Undeniably, the most famous and well-preserved poetry from the era was Homer's, in particular his Iliad. Plato, a famous Athenian philosopher, would later tell us that Homer had gained a reputation as being, quote, the educator of all Greece, unquote, as the main form of ancient Greek education occurred through the teaching of playwrights. Modern audiences can see just how influential the classical figure of Homer was to the ancient Greeks and how true Plato's expression is. By the way, it struck me um, why I was blanking there. Lyric poetry and also these other poetic tools such as assonance and rhythm, all of this and rhyme, all of this has to do with memorization devices. If a poem rhymes or if it has a similar beat throughout, those of you who memorize poetry will know this, it's easier for your brain to retain it. And we might imagine also the eventual development of musical instruments, starting with the drum, was a similar method to memorize poetry in this world of the memorized bard. Plato's expression illustrates the impact Homer had during his lifetime and the long-standing impact his work would garner centuries after his death. This demonstrates how the Iliad was impactful for so long as a formative text to the ancient Greeks to be taught social, cultural customs and beliefs. It really is the closest thing you have to a Bible in the classical world, outside of the Hebrews and the Hindus. Memory is a significant theme explored in Homer's Iliad. His epic poetry illustrates how people, their actions in the past can be remembered, even memorialized. As an educator of the people, Homer illustrated his understanding of the influence of the playwrights in teaching the polis in a section of the Iliad. Homer's argument was through, quote, an inspiration of the muses, unquote. Yeah, there's that religious connection, who were the daughters of memory, and said that poetry can save the memories of the past, the people and events that transpired. We know this because the Iliad was copied down centuries after Homer's death. It had become so memorable that people brought the stories down through generations until it was written down between 750 and 700 BC, even though the Trojan War happened in the Bronze Age long before that. Homer tells the audience, muses who have your homes on Olympus, for you are goddesses and ever present and know all things, and we hear only rumor and do not know anything, unquote. By the way, how do you know? How do you know the story precedes its canonization in, we'll say, 700 BC? How do you know you're dealing with a much older story? Again, because you have fingerprints of an earlier Bronze Age in there. Again, the nature of warfare is basically single combat. It is warfare, but it's very primitive. You have ox-drawn wagons, and you don't have cavalry. You have individual guys on horseback, but you don't have the development of cavalry. All of those are fingerprints placing you at a much, much earlier time period. That's how people can come to these conclusions. In this long passage in the Iliad, the argument is illustrated that through the muses, one could preserve the actions of the past. In other words, in the minds of the ancient Greeks, while those in the present hear only rumor, the stories told from older generations are there to learn from, as nor do we know anything, right? So again, you're passing on the tribal traditions. Homer's Iliad is not only revolutionary for the time, through the introduction of the epic poem, but from a modern perspective, it is influential in illustrating the nature of archaic Greek world. A central figure, going back, Homer's epic confronts the Trojan War. Audiences are introduced to the heroic archetype, Achilles. We'll look at archetypes in the future. A central figure to the ancient Greek mythology who demonstrates the socio-cultural and political-cultural attitudes of ancient Greek. The audience is shown a dilemma through Achilles as to whether one should aim to live a long and happy life without any reverence for the afterlife or die heroically as a young man and war hero. As an allegory, these central ideas are significant in illustrating what the audience learns about the ancient Greek world from lyric poetry. Audiences learn that the ancient Greeks put a heavy significance on the role of death and the afterlife within their society, especially how the dead are remembered through the living. The Trojan War is a significant historical event in the era of ancient Greece and has been continually mythologized by different cultures to illustrate strength in overcoming adversity. Homer's poetry can be considered, to a great extent, um, behind why the ancient Greeks viewed the Trojan War as a significant historical event. Right, the literature, in other words, because everyone's reading it, and this is, in a sense, the instruction manual. This long forgotten war, and who knows whatever the consequences. Like many wars in the past, and kind of as a poem, "The Battle of Blenheim," by Robert Southey tells us, what was that war about and what exactly came about from this war? And you should look up that poem, "The Battle of Blenheim." Well, likewise, the Trojan War, that event happened and life moved on, and maybe it moved on to such a point that people, could not perceive the ramifications of the Trojan War. And yet, because for centuries after, Greeks and then Romans and then, uh, medievals after them were reading this event takes on a mythological exaggeration in much the same way, for instance, the Davidic kingdom, uh, which, taken objectively, was a small fish in a big pond, let's say. If all you're doing is reading the books of Kings and Chronicles and Psalms and whatever, you would, your appraisal of these events becomes mythologized and takes on dynamics that, are at dissonance from the historical record. Doesn't mean they're wrong, but an exaggeration from the facts on the ground, let's say. That's the purpose. I go on about that here because that's the I shouldn't say the purpose, but that is the legacy of these bards and these bardic poems and things. They preserve things, but they necessarily, the subjects take on an outsourced, outsized, an outsized significance than may have been the case in the moment. In which case, I suppose, the very canonization of these events. I mean, this proves, I guess, why you want the bard around. You have the bard around to remember your tribe's past, and so he does. And in fact, he memorizes the past in such a way that the past takes on these mythological dimensions that it didn't have in reality. So home run for the bards. They're doing their job. When there were times of crisis for the ancient Greeks, the famous text, when it was made text, become the unifying factor which signified the glory of the great Achilles. The spirit that Achilles has in the Iliad, the audience learns, is used by all ancient Greeks to overcome war, suffering, and hardships. The mythologizing of the event helps the audience to understand how its role in changing history can be used to unify people during difficult times. The goal of this was for the ancient Greeks to remember and memorialize their military victories, to garner patriotism in order to die as a hero for one's country. Homer in the Iliad even uses the event of the fall of Troy as an example to illustrate his attitude, quote unquote, "a thing whose glory shall perish never." The theme of the Iliad, that resounding fame achieved in dying as a young war hero, would gain you as an individual the right to be memorialized in the history of the tribe, and for your community to honor and glorify you as a hero further demonstrates the extent of the ancient Greeks' fixation on death in the afterlife, and how this was impacted by memorialization as a war hero. Social standing as an ancient Greek citizen often depended on family history and how they were remembered. Homer uses the character of Odysseus to illustrate that the wrong action to take would be, quote unquote, disgraceful to wait long and at the end to go home empty handed. And it goes on, Autum nomine, miserat in nobis. The importance of Homer to the Greeks and his influence on modern culture by Sophie Simon. And this will form the second round of readings, which I'm editing in to the week by week partitioning of the outline of history by H.G. Wells. So little by little, the building of this final publication project. Soldiers on, treks on, to use a word in this week's reading. Okay, so we're going to put the bird down there and just recap things. All right, so take over the screen. Registering it. Okay, there we go. No, there we go. Just like the Aryans took over the took over the world, I take over the screen. Okay, so there we go. Let's recap things. We began with just a reminder of what the project is, and that there are many ways you can enroll here at Apocatastastis to become part of this work, full-time, monthly, bi-weekly, or whatever the case may be, and also joining in our open events and following even these public shows. Of course, if you enroll, you're going to get a lot more one-on-one with myself and the other staff members at Apocatastastis, and much more personalized discussion and writing projects and so forth. But after that, we moved to Robbie Barron's poem "To a Mouse," which is our Substack feature this week. I hope you're subscribed to that. And then we moved on to H.G. Wells, and we looked at migration patterns, living patterns, and then ultimately cultural transmission patterns through the invention of the bard, which is a consequence of knowing you're going to die just as much as you know you didn't exist at a certain point. The bard, by plugging your own life and your memories and your poetry into that of the community, which will hopefully outlive you, the bard eases the starkness of that temporal consciousness. And then we carried on by looking at the influence of the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, noting very carefully that this is the preservation of a much older story, proved by the references in the book, which long predate the 7th century BC in Greece. We're coming precious close to the beginning of history. Next week, we're going to see that with Egyptian and Sumerian civilization, and which one comes first, if we want to get into that discussion. And we're going to get into the development of writing, again, another spin-off of the temple, commerce with a spin-off of the temple, just as soon as this week we saw the bard was the same, the temple being a shorthand for all of those aspects of society that indeed do develop out of religious worship itself, probably a reaction to the temporal consciousness and the consciousness of mortality. All right, well, that will do it for this week 5 of 13 in our fall volume of the project. You can download the project from the site below. And I encourage you to check out our website and all the great things we have here at Apocatastastis as we rebuild formal education and we rebuild culture. Okay, thank you so much. Take care.